Welcome to Bristoe Station Battlefield Heritage Park. My name is Kevin Pawlak with the Prince William County Historic Preservation Division. Today, join me on a virtual tour of one of two trails here at the Battlefield Park. The trail that you're about to tour will take you through former Confederate encampments in 1861 and to the 1862 Kettle Run battlefield. Bristoe Station Battlefield Heritage Park is a 140-acre historic landmark in western Prince William County. It is not just the site of two Civil War battles, but the site of multiple Civil War encampments, and it also shares the history of the community of Bristoe. Join me as we walk the 1861-1862 trail here at Bristoe Station Battlefield. To my right is a reconstructed Civil War hut, demonstrating to our visitors what soldiers might have built here during the many encampments that dotted the landscape around Bristoe Station from 1861 to 1865. While most visitors to the park today are familiar with the 1862 and 1863 battles at Bristoe Station, many visitors are unaware that throughout the course of the Civil War, both Union and Confederate soldiers constantly camped on the grounds around Bristoe Station. The first encampment was in the fall of 1861. The Confederate troops that camped here, soldiers from Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, and Tennessee, referred to this encampment as Camp Jones, named for Colonel Egbert Jones of the 4th Alabama Infantry, who was mortally wounded during the Battle of First Manassas on July 21st of 1861. Camp Jones was established in early August 1861 here at Bristoe Station due to the encampment's proximity to the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which could bring supplies to the soldiers camped here, and also because there was an abundance of natural spring water in the area. However, Camp Jones was no paradise for the Confederate soldiers that were camped here. Instead, it became a disease-infested encampment, where perhaps as many as 5 to 6 soldiers died every single day from various camp diseases. One of the Alabama soldiers that was camped here noted that every single day he was here at Camp Jones, he could hear volleys of rifle fire off in the distance, not from battles, but instead from military burials. Confederate troops moved on from Camp Jones in the summer of 1861 to other locations throughout Prince William County. Come April of 1862, the first Union troops to arrive in Bristoe Station came here and referred to this place as Camp Snow because of the terrible weather that they encountered when they were here at Bristoe Station. Throughout the rest of the war, soldiers of both North and South, but especially the Union soldiers, held on to the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and were constantly protecting the rail line from partisan rangers. Then in the winter of 1863-64, soldiers from Pennsylvania under the command of General Samuel Crawford encamped here, and they completed what was basically the destruction of wartime Bristoe Station. Winter huts, such as this one to my right, were built from makeshift materials of abandoned homes and stores at Bristoe Station, and many of the trees and fence lines around the area that once made up farms for the civilians of Bristoe were turned into huts and quarters for soldiers. When civilians returned to their homes in 1865, they found that their fence lines were gone, their trees cut down, and in some cases even, their homes were no longer standing due to the many encampments that took place here from 1861 to 1865. Now standing in the 10th Alabama Cemetery, the only Civil War burial ground whose location is known here at the Battlefield Park. The 10th Alabama was one of the Confederate units camped at Camp Jones in the summer of 1861. Because of the disease that ran rampantly through that camp, many cemeteries were established. Typically, the soldiers were buried designated by either unit or state. Though we have evidence of other cemeteries located here around Bristoe Station, the 10th Alabama Cemetery is the only one that we know exactly where it is. Many of the soldiers buried in the ground behind me, 82 to be exact, died from disease. However, the 10th Alabama revered this burial ground so much that when it was engaged in one of its first battles of the Civil War, the Battle of Drainesville in December of 1861, some of the casualties from that battle in the 10th Alabama were brought back here and laid to rest. Union soldiers in the spring of 1862 wrote about seeing this cemetery, as well as a nearby one, to Mississippi soldiers. Originally, cedar planks were established and placed at the head of each grave to denote where the soldiers were buried. However, as you can see behind me, none of those planks exist today. At some point, stones were erected at the head of each grave to denote where the graves were and possibly who was buried there. Though we have been able to locate 82 separate grave shafts, we know of the names of only 41, just half of the men who are buried here. And unfortunately, because of very few grave markers left standing today, we do not know exactly in which grave each of those 41 men rest. In 1909, James Coleman, a veteran of the 10th Alabama Infantry, came to visit some of the battlefields where he experienced the American Civil War. One of the places he stopped was back here at the cemetery to his comrades from the 10th Alabama Infantry. Coleman tried to buy the small plot of land, the first preservation effort, here at Bristoe Station. But the lady that owned the property, ironically the daughter of a Union veteran, refused to sell to Coleman. However, she promised that she would keep the cemetery intact and protected as long as she owned the land. Coleman went back home to Alabama and tried to raise money to erect a monument to the members of the 10th Alabama who were buried here, and to get an accurate roster of the names of the men who are resting in this ground here behind me. However, Coleman's efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, and no monument was erected. But in 2012, shortly after the establishment of the park here, an Eagle Scout project cleared this space, opened it up to what it might have once looked like during the Civil War, and also a monument dedicated by the state of Alabama was erected in 2012 to remember the soldiers of the 10th Alabama who rest in this ground here today. On August 27, 1862, in the field behind me, the Battle of Kettle Run, part of the Second Manassas campaign, occurred. Before the armies arrived here at Bristoe Station in August of 1862, the Civil War had taken a drastic turn. Just a few months earlier, Union armies were pressing outside the Confederate capital of Richmond, and it seemed that, as many predicted, the war might be over by the 4th of July of 1862. However, Confederate troops pushed those Union forces back away from the Confederate capital before turning north under the command of Robert E. Lee to defeat a second Union army sent to Richmond from Washington under the command of Union General John Pope. The two armies became stalemated along the Rappahannock River in mid-August. But beginning early on the morning of August 25, 1862, Robert E. Lee dispatched one of his lieutenants, Stonewall Jackson, and 24,000 men to march around John Pope's army and cut its supply line, which was the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which stands in the tree line just a few hundred yards behind me. Jackson's 24,000 men marched 54 miles in 36 hours, and by the evening of August 26th, they reached Bristoe Station. Confederate troops initially began piling wood and whatever they could find onto the tracks to stop the trains moving between Alexandria and Warrenton Junction, Alexandria being to your left and Warrenton Junction to the right of the camera. Just as Jackson's troops arrived, they heard the whistle of a train moving from Warrenton Junction. As the train passed through and sped through Bristoe Station, Confederate troops opened fire on it, but the first train was able to make it through, not quite unscathed, with many bullet holes through its skin, but it made it back to Manassas Junction. Soon a second train came through. Confederate troops managed to derail that train, and then soon followed by a third train. And by the night of August 26th, Confederate troops had cut John Pope's supply line at the Orange and Alexandria Railroad here at Bristoe Station and managed to wreck 2 locomotives and 24 rail cars. That night, John Pope received intelligence that something was not right in his rear. And so the morning of August 27th, he dispatched one Union regiment, the 72nd New York Infantry, up the rail line in the direction of Manassas Junction to figure out what was going on. The 72nd, under the command of Captain Harmon Bliss, approached Bristoe Station, found the Confederates in force, and pulled back towards Kettle Run, which is just less than a mile off to the right. From Kettle Run, Bliss reported back to Pope that Confederates held Bristoe Station in force, and soon John Pope dispatched a larger force, nearly 7,000 Union soldiers, to begin marching up the rail line and reopen his supply line here at Bristoe Station, setting the stage for the Battle of Kettle Run on the afternoon of August 27th. The sun beat down on Union soldiers as they marched up the Orange and Alexandria rail line on the afternoon of August 27th. It was in fact probably over 90 degrees, and one Union soldier reported that his shirt and his clothes were as wet from perspiration as they might have been if he had just passed through a rainstorm. But nonetheless, by 2 p.m. on August 27th, Union soldiers approached Kettle Run and found out what they were up against. Earlier that morning, Stonewall Jackson moved with the majority of his force further towards Manassas Junction, about 5 miles behind me. However, he left behind one division of his 24,000-man column under the command of Richard Ewell, a local Prince William County native, to protect the rail line and protect Jackson's men while they ransacked Manassas Junction. Most of Ewell's men were positioned about 600 yards behind me along modern-day Bristoe Road or Route 619. However, Ewell dispatched 2 Louisiana regiments, the 6th and the 8th Louisiana, all the way forward to Kettle Run. If needed, they were ordered to burn the Kettle Run Bridge and then slowly fall back towards the main Confederate position here at Bristoe Station. The first contact between the two armies was made at about 2 p.m., and slowly the Louisiana regiments fell back, until finally they reached their final position in the tree line behind me, about 400 yards from Bristoe Station itself. At about 2:30, 2 Union regiments, one from New York, the other from New Jersey, passed into this open field, passed over the ground where I'm standing now, and into the field behind me when they came under fire from those Louisiana regiments, as well as several Confederate artillery pieces posted on the high ground behind them. The New Yorkers and the New Jerseyans were cut to pieces, caught in this open field of fire, and soon the commander of that Union column, General Joseph Hooker, was dispatching more troops to the front lines. Those soldiers were all from New York and members of the famed Excelsior Brigade that moved up to support their fellow New Yorkers and New Jerseyans in the fight here along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. As Colonel Nelson Taylor's Excelsior Brigade was moving up to support the 1st Union regiments engaged on the Kettle Run battlefield, he noticed to his right, on the other side of the railroad tracks, to my left and your right, a Confederate unit moving up to utilize the embankment of the railroad to fire down the length of the Union line positioned in this field. In order to counter this threat, Taylor dispatched 2 of his regiments, the 70th and 72nd New York, to this low swell of ground to contest the Georgians on the other side of the railroad track. A very close quarters and intense firefight was then ensuing on all parts of the battlefield, between the Louisianans and the New Yorkers in the tree line, and the New Yorkers and the Georgians here along the railroad. Soon 2 other Union regiments joined the fight along the railroad, one from Pennsylvania and yet another from New Jersey, and the position of the 60th Georgia soon proved to be untenable. In fact, at one point, the 60th Georgia lost its battle flag, only in a desperate encounter to regain its flag before falling back further and further towards the railroad. Richard Ewell was now faced with a serious question. Without orders of retreating from his commanding officer, Stonewall Jackson, but under serious pressure from the Federals, Richard Ewell had to decide what to do next. Stay and fight here at Bristoe Station, or pull back closer to Stonewall Jackson's command. Thankfully for Ewell, his answer would soon arrive. We're now standing at the position of Colonel Henry Forno's 3 Louisiana regiments that were engaged in the Battle of Kettle Run. Throughout the afternoon of August 27th, constant Union pressure and growing Union pressure was applied to the 3 Louisiana regiments here and the 60th Georgia posted on the other side of the railroad behind me. Just as Richard Ewell was faced with the question of what to do as mounting Union pressure grew in his front, he prepared to withdraw and bring the command back to Manassas Junction, closer to the rest of Stonewall Jackson's column. However, thankfully for Ewell, just at that time, he received explicit orders from Jackson not to bring on a general engagement, and if the enemy appeared in force, to fall back to the rest of Jackson's command at Manassas Junction. Ewell did just that, and by the evening of August 27th, the Battle of Kettle Run came to an end. Though the battle was relatively short in duration and small in size as compared to other major Civil War engagements, the events that occurred here at Kettle Run were nonetheless incredibly important to the outcome of the Second Manassas campaign and to the soldiers who fought here. The Confederates that fought here suffered about 180 casualties, men killed, wounded, missing, or captured in the action. For the Union aggressors and attackers on this battlefield, the casualties were more than double, what the Louisianans and Georgians suffered, about 420 Union casualties. Union Army Commander John Pope arrived here at Bristoe Station on the night of August 27th, and he was flushed with having seen a victorious battlefield for his Union Army. Pope proclaimed to one of his subordinates that we should bag the whole crowd, and for the next few days, John Pope became fixated on crushing Stonewall Jackson's isolated command. In doing so, Pope ignored the rest of Robert E. Lee's army under the command of James Longstreet that was going to form a junction with Stonewall Jackson in the area of the old Manassas battlefield. Pope attacked Jackson's lines on August 28th, 29th, and the 30th. But on the afternoon of August 30th, Robert E. Lee unleashed the second half of his army, Longstreet's command, on Pope's unsuspecting lines, and John Pope and his Army of Virginia were driven back to the defenses of Washington by early September 1862. It began here at Kettle Run on August 27th, spelled further disaster for the Union war effort. Just a few days later, the news grew even more dim as Confederates crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, beginning the first Confederate invasion of the North. When you come to Bristoe Station Battlefield Heritage Park today, I hope that you will walk the 1861-62 trail and visit the cemetery of the 10th Alabama. Walk these fields where soldiers from New York, Louisiana, New Jersey, and Georgia fought on a hot afternoon of August 27, 1862, and helped to decide the fate of the Second Manassas campaign and the entire course of the United States and Confederate States of America in the summer of 1862.